Chapter 16. The Turnover of Variable Capital. Section 1. The Annual Rate of Surplus Value. Let us take a circulating capital of £2,500, with 4/5 of this, £2,000, being constant capital, material elements of production, and 1/5, £500, being variable capital, capital laid out on wages. Let the turnover period be 5 weeks, the working period 4 weeks, and the circulation period 1 week. Capital 1 is then £2,000, consisting of £1,600 constant capital and £400 variable capital. Capital 2 is £500, of which £400 is constant and £100 variable. In each working week, a capital of £500 is laid out. In a year of 50 weeks, an annual product of 50 times 500, totaling £25,000, is produced. The capital 1 of £2,000 that is applied in each working period thus turns over 12½ times. 12½ times 2,000 is £25,000. Of this £25,000, 4/5, totaling 20,000, is constant capital laid out on means of production, and 1/5, £5,000, is variable laid out on wages. The total capital of £2,500, on the other hand, turns over 25,000 over 2,500, totaling 10 times. The variable circulating capital, expended in the course of production, can serve again in the circulation process only to the extent that the product in which its value is reproduced is sold, transformed from commodity capital into money capital, so that it can be laid out anew in payment for labor power. But this is just the same for the constant circulating capital laid out in production, on materials, whose value also reappears as a portion of the value of the product. What these two parts of the circulating capital, the constant and the variable, have in common, and what distinguishes them from fixed capital, is not that the value they have transferred to the product is circulated by commodity capital, i.e. circulates through the circulation of the product as a commodity. A portion of the product's value, and hence of the product itself circulating as a commodity, of the commodity capital, always consists of the wear and tear of the fixed capital, or the part of the fixed capital's value that it is transferred to the product in the course of production. The difference is rather that the fixed capital continues to function in the productive process in its old shape, through a longer or shorter cycle of turnover periods of the circulating capital, that is, the circulating constant plus the circulating variable capital, while any single turnover has as its precondition the replacement of the entire circulating capital that enters the circulation sphere from the production sphere in the shape of commodity capital. The first phase of circulation, C' to M', is common to both fluid constant and fluid variable capital. In the second phase, these separate. The money into which the commodity is transformed back is partly converted into a production stock, circulating constant capital. According to the different terms of purchase of the components of this stock, one part of the money may be converted into materials of production earlier, another part later, but eventually it goes into these completely. A further part of the money released by the sale of the commodity remains in the form of a money reserve, to be spent bit by bit in payment for the labor power incorporated into the production process. It forms the circulating variable capital. Nonetheless, the entire replacement of one or the other part derives each time from the turnover of the capital, its transformation into a product, from product into commodity, and from commodity into money. This is the reason why, in the previous chapter, we could treat the turnover of both constant and variable capital together as a separate theme, without regard to the fixed capital. For the question that we have to deal with now, we must go one step further and treat the variable part of the circulating capital as if it alone formed the circulating capital. In other words, we shall disregard here the constant circulating capital that turns over together with the variable capital. £2,500 has been advanced, and the value of the annual product is £25,000. But the variable part of the circulating capital is £500. Hence, the variable capital contained in the £25,000 is £5,000. If we divide the £5,000 by 500, then we get the number of turnovers, 10, just as with the total capital of £2,500. This average calculation, in which the value of the annual product is divided by the value of the capital advanced, and not by the value of that part of this capital that is constantly applied in a particular working period, i.e. in this case not by 400 but by 500, not by capital 1 but rather capital 1 plus capital 2, is here, where only the production of surplus value is at issue, absolutely exact. We shall see later on, though, that from another point of view it is inexact, just as this average calculation in general is not quite exact. It is sufficient for the practical purposes of the capitalist, but it does not adequately or precisely express all the real circumstances of the turnover. Up to now, we have completely left out of account one part of the value of the commodity capital, i.e. the surplus value contained in it, which is produced during the production process and has been incorporated into the product. This is what we have now to turn our attention to. Let us assume that the variable capital of £100 laid out each week produces a surplus value of 100%, totaling £100. Then the variable capital of £500 laid out in the course of the turnover period of 5 weeks produces a surplus value of £500, i.e., half of the working day consists of surplus labor. But if a variable capital of £500 produces £500, then 5,000 produces a surplus value of 10 times 500, totaling £5,000. The variable capital advanced, however, is £500. The ratio of the total surplus value annually produced to the value of the variable capital advanced we call the annual rate of surplus value. In the present case, this is 5,000 over 500, totaling 1,000%. If we analyze this rate more closely, it is clear that it is equal to the rate of surplus value that the variable capital advance produces during one turnover period, multiplied by the number of turnovers of the variable capital, which is the same as the number of turnovers of the total circulating capital. The variable capital advanced in one turnover period is £500 in the present case, and the surplus value produced in it is also £500. The rate of surplus value in one turnover period is therefore 500s over 500v, totaling 100%. This 100% multiplied by 10, the number of turnovers in the year, gives 5,000s over 500v, totaling 1,000%. This holds for the annual rate of surplus value. But as far as the mass of the surplus value obtained during a particular turnover period is concerned, this is equal to the value of the variable capital advanced during this period, here £500, multiplied by the rate of surplus value, here 500 times 100 over 100, equaling 500 times 1, equaling £500. If the capital advance was £1,500 with the same rate of surplus value, then the mass of surplus value would be 1,500 times 100 over 100, totaling £1,500. The variable capital of £500, which turns over 10 times in the year, producing an annual surplus value of £5,000, its annual rate of surplus value thus being 1,000%, we shall call capital A. Let us now suppose that another variable capital B of £5,000 is advanced for a whole year, i.e. here for 50 weeks, and hence turns over only once in the year. We further assume that the product is paid for at the end of the year on the same day that it is finished, so that the money capital into which it is transformed returns the same day. The circulation period is here now 0. The turnover period is the same as the working period, i.e. 1 year. As in the previous case, a variable capital of £100 is in the labor process each week, hence £5,000 in 50 weeks. The rate of surplus value is also the same, 100%, i.e. with the working day of the same length, half of this consists of surplus labor. If we take 5 weeks, then the variable capital applied is £500, the rate of surplus value 100%, and the mass of surplus value created during the 5 weeks is therefore £500. The amount of labor power that is exploited and the degree of its exploitation are exactly the same here, on the assumptions made, as in capital A. In any 1 week, the variable capital of £100 that is applied produces a surplus value of £100. And so in 50 weeks, the capital of 50 times 100, equaling £5,000, produces a surplus value of £5,000. The mass of surplus value annually produced is the same as in the previous case, £5,000, but the annual rate of surplus value is quite different. Here, the surplus value produced during the year, divided by the variable capital advanced, is 5,000s over 5,000v, 100%, whereas for capital A it was 1,000%. In the case of both capital A and capital B, we have the expenditure of £100 variable capital each week. The degree of valorization, or the rate of surplus value, is the same, 100%, and the magnitude of the variable capital is also the same, £100. The same amount of labor power is exploited, and the degree and scale of exploitation are in both cases the same. The working days are equal and similarly divided into necessary labor and surplus labor. The sum of variable capital applied during the year is equally large, £5,000, and sets the same amount of labor in motion, while the same mass of surplus value is extracted from the labor power set in motion by the two equal capitals, £5,000. Yet, there is a difference of 900% in the annual rate of surplus value between A and B. This phenomenon makes it appear, moreover, as if the rate of surplus value did not depend only on the amount of variable capital and the rate of exploitation of the labor power set in motion by it, but also on inexplicable influences deriving from the circulation process. And in fact, the phenomenon has been interpreted in this way, if not in this pure form, then at least in its more complicated and concealed form, that of the annual rate of profit. Since the beginning of the 1820s, this phenomenon has led to the complete destruction of the Ricardian school. However, its strangeness immediately disappears if we really do place capitals A and B in exactly the same conditions, and do not just appear to do so. The same conditions obtain only if the variable capital B is wholly spent on payment of labor power in the same interval of time as capital A. The £5,000 of capital B is then paid out in 5 weeks, £1,000 per week, giving an outlay of £50,000 over the year. The surplus value is now also £50,000 under our assumptions. The capital turned over, £50,000, divided by the capital advanced, £5,000, gives the number of turnovers, 10. The rate of surplus value, 5,000S over 5,000V, equals 100%, multiplied by the number of turnovers, 10, gives the annual rate of surplus value, 50,000S over 5,000V, 10 over 1 being 1,000%. The annual rates of surplus value for A and B are now the same, i.e. 1,000%, but the mass of surplus value is, for B, £50,000 and for A, £5,000. The masses of surplus values produced are now in the same ratio as the capital values B and A that were advanced, i.e. 5,000 to 500 being 10 to 1. This is the reason why capital B could set 10 times as much labor power in motion in the same time as capital A. It is only the capital actually operating in the labor process which creates surplus value, and to which all the laws given for surplus value apply, including the law that, with a given rate of surplus value, the mass of surplus value is given by the relative magnitude of the variable capital. The labor process itself is measured by time, the length of the working day being given, as it is here where we assume equality between capital A and capital B in all circumstances, in order to present the differences in the annual rate of surplus value in a clear light. The working week consists of a definite number of working days. Alternatively, we can treat each working period, for example here a 5-week one, as a single working day of 300 hours, for example if the working day is 10 hours and the week 6 working days. We must then multiply this figure by the number of workers who are employed alongside one another each day in the same labor process. If this number was 10, for example, then the weekly total would be 60 times 10, totaling 600 hours, and a 5-week working period would amount to 600 times 5 being 3,000 hours. Variable capitals at the same side are thus applied if, with the same rate of surplus value and the same length of working day, equal amounts of labor power, one labor power of the given price multiplied by the given number of workers, are set in motion in the same interval of time. Let us now return to our original examples. In both cases, A and B, equal variable capitals, £100 per week, are applied each week of the year. The variable capitals that are applied and actually function in the labor process are therefore the same, but the variable capitals advanced are quite unequal. With A, £500 is advanced every 5 weeks, and £100 of this is applied each week. With B, £5,000 has to be advanced for the first 5-week period, but out of this only £100 per week, and thus in these 5 weeks only £500. 1/10 of the capital advanced is actually applied. In the second 5-week period, £4,500 has to be advanced, but only £500 is applied, and so on. The variable capital advanced for a certain period of time is transformed into applied, i.e. really functioning and effective variable capital only to the degree that it actually does enter those sections of the period of time in question that are filled by the labor process, and really does function in this labor process. In the intervening period in which a part of it is advanced for application only at a later date, this part is as good as non-existent for the labor process, and thus does not have any influence on the formation of either value or surplus value. Take capital A of £500 for instance. It is advanced for 5 weeks, but each week only £100 of it successively enters the labor process. In the first week, 1/5 of it is applied. 4/5 is advanced without being applied, although since it must be on hand for the labor process of the 4 following weeks, it must certainly be advanced. The circumstances that differentiate the ratio between the advanced and the applied variable capital affect the production of surplus value, at a given rate of profit, only insofar as they differentiate the amount of variable capital which can actually be applied in a definite period of time, for example in 1 week, 5 weeks, etc. The variable capital advanced functions as variable capital only to the extent that it is actually applied, and during the time for which it is applied, not during the time in which it remains advanced in reserve without being applied. But all circumstances that differentiate the ratio between advanced and applied variable capital can be summed up in the difference in turnover periods, determined by a difference either in working periods or in circulation periods or in both. The law of surplus value production is that, with the same rate of surplus value, equal amounts of functioning variable capital create equal masses of surplus value. So, if equal amounts of variable capital are applied by capitals A and B for the same space of time at the same rate of surplus value, then they must produce equal amounts of surplus value in this time, no matter how different may be the ratio between the variable capital applied in the time in question and the variable capital advanced during the same time. and hence how different also the ratio between the mass of surplus value produced and the total variable capital advanced, rather than that actually applied. The variation of this ratio, instead of contradicting the laws put forward for the production of surplus value, rather confirms these, and is an inescapable consequence of them. Let us consider the first 5-week production period of capital B. At the end of week 5, £500 has been applied and consumed. The value produced is £1,000, 500s over 500v totaling 100%. It is just the same with capital A. The fact that capital A has realized its surplus value along with the capital advanced, while B has not, is of no importance to us here, where the issue is simply the production of surplus value and its ratio to the variable capital advanced during its production. If, on the other hand, we calculate the ratio of the surplus value in B to the total capital of £5,000 advanced, and not to that part of the capital that is applied during its production and hence consumed, then we get 500s over 5,000v totaling 1/10, totaling 10%. That is 10% for capital B as against 100%, 10 times as much for capital A. If it be said here that this difference in the rate of surplus value for capitals of equal magnitude, which have set in motion an equal quantity of labor, and moreover labor that is divided into the same portions of paid and unpaid labor, contradicts the laws of surplus value production, the answer is simple, and given by a mere glance at the factual relations. For A, it is the actual rate of surplus value that is expressed here, i.e. the ratio of the surplus value produced during 5 weeks by a variable capital of £500 to this variable capital of £500. For B, on the other hand, the mode of reckoning is one that has nothing to do with either the production of surplus value or the corresponding determination of the rate of surplus value. The £500 surplus value which has been produced by the variable capital of £500 is in fact not calculated on the basis of the £500 variable capital that is advanced during its production, but rather on a capital of £5,000, 9/10 of which, i.e. £4,500, has nothing at all to do with the production of this surplus value of £500, but is rather designed to function gradually over the course of the following 45 weeks, and does not exist at all as far as the production of the first 5 weeks goes, which is all that we are concerned with here. In this case, therefore, the difference in the rate of surplus value between A and B is no problem at all. Let us now compare the annual rates of surplus value for capitals A and B. For capital B, we have 5,000s over 5,000v, totaling 100%. For capital A, 5,000s over 500v, totaling 1,000%. The ratio of the surplus value rates, however, is still the same as before. Then we had surplus value rate for capital B over surplus value rate for capital A, totaling 10% over 100%. And now we have the annual rate of surplus value for capital B being 100% over the annual rate of surplus value for capital A being 1,000%. But 10% over 100% is equal to 100% over 1,000%, the same ratio as before. For all that, the problem has now been turned round the other way. The annual rate for capital B, 5,000s over 5,000v, being 100%, does not present the slightest divergence, not even the shadow of a divergence from the laws of surplus value production which we already knew, and the rate of surplus value corresponding to these. 5,000v has already been advanced during the year and productively consumed, having produced 5,000s. The rate of surplus value is thus the above fraction 5,000s over 5,000v, 100%. The annual rate of surplus value agrees with the actual rate. This time it is not capital B that presents the anomaly to be explained, as it did last time, but rather capital A. Here, we have the rate of surplus value 5,000s over 500v, totaling 1,000%. But if in the first case 500, the product of 5 weeks, was calculated on a capital advance of £5,000, 9/10 of which was not applied in its production, now 5,000s is calculated on the basis of 500v, i.e. only on 1/10 of the variable capital that was really applied in the production of 5,000s. For the 5,000s is the product of a variable capital of £5,000 that is productively consumed over 50 weeks, and not of the capital of £500 used during one single 5-week period. In the first case, the surplus value produced during 5 weeks was calculated on the capital that was advanced for 50 weeks, i.e. a capital 10 times greater than that used during the 5 weeks. Now, the surplus value produced in 50 weeks is calculated on the capital which was advanced for 5 weeks, and which is thus 10 times smaller than that used during the 50 weeks. Capital A of £500 is not advanced for any longer than 5 weeks. At the end of this period it returns and can repeat the same process 10 times in the course of the year by turning over 10 times. 2 things follow from this. Firstly, the capital advanced in case A is only 5 times greater than the portion of capital applied than any 1 week's production process. Capital B, on the other hand, which turns over only once in 50 weeks, must therefore also be advanced for 50 weeks, and is 50 times greater than the part of the capital that can ever be applied in 1 week. The turnover time thus modifies the ratio between the capital advanced for the production process during the year and the capital applied for any given production period, for example, the week. And this gives us the first case, in which the surplus value of 5 weeks is reckoned not on the capital applied during these 5 weeks, but rather on the 10 times greater capital that is applied over 50 weeks. Secondly, the turnover period of capital A, 5 weeks, comprises only 1/10 of the year. The year, therefore, includes 10 such turnover periods in which capital A of £500 is each time applied afresh. The capital applied here is equal to the capital advance for 5 weeks multiplied by the number of turnover periods in the year. The capital applied during the year is 500 times 10, totaling £5,000. The capital advanced during the year is 5,000 divided by 10, totaling £500. In point of fact, even though the £500 is always applied afresh, never more than the same £500 is applied every 5 weeks. In the case of capital B, it is still only £500 that is applied in advance for these 5 weeks, but since the turnover period is now 50 weeks, the capital applied during the year is the same as the capital advance not for every 5 weeks but for every 50. The mass of surplus value produced annually, however, is governed, at a given rate of surplus value, by the capital applied during the year, and not by that advanced. Thus, it is no greater for this capital of £5,000 that turns over once than it is for the capital of £500 that turns over 10 times. And the only reason why it is the size it is that the capital that turns over once in the year is itself 10 times greater than that turning over 10 times. The variable capital turned over during the year, i.e. the part of the annual product or the annual expenditure equal to this part, is the variable capital actually applied and productively consumed in the course of the year. It follows, therefore, that if the variable capital A turned over annually and the variable capital B turned over annually are the same, and they are applied under the same conditions of valorization, the rate of surplus value must be the same for both. And since the masses of capital applied are the same, so must be the annually reckoned rate of surplus value, as long as it is expressed as the mass of surplus value annually produced over the annual turnover of variable capital. To express it more generally, whatever may be the relative magnitudes of the variable capitals turned over, the rate of surplus value that they produce in the course of a year is determined by the rate of surplus value at which the respective capitals have operated in average periods, for example on a weekly or even daily average. This is the only possible result that follows from the laws of surplus value production and those determining the rate of surplus value. Let us now look once again at what the ratio annual turnover of capital over capital advanced expresses. We are dealing here only with the variable capital, as already stated. The quotient gives the number of turnovers of the capital advanced in 1 year. For capital A, we have £5,000 capital annually turned over £500 capital advanced. For capital B, that is £5,000 annually turned over £5,000 advanced. In both ratios, the numerator expresses the capital advanced multiplied by the number of turnovers. For A, 500 times 10, for B, 5,000 times 1. Alternatively, the capital is multiplied by the reciprocal of the turnover time, reckoned in terms of a year. The turnover time for A is 1/10 of a year. The reciprocal of this is 10 over 1, and 500 times 10 over 1 is 5,000. For B, 5,000 times 1 over 1 is equal to 5,000. The denominator expresses the capital turned over multiplied by the reciprocal of the number of turnovers. For A, 5,000 times 1 over 10, for B, 5,000 times 1 over 1. The respective quantities of labor, the sum of the paid and the unpaid labor that are set in motion, are the same here, since the capitals turned over are the same, and so are their rates of valorization. The ratio between the variable capital annually turned over and that advanced indicates, firstly, the ratio in which the capital to be advanced stands to the variable capital applied in a certain working period. If the number of turnovers is 10, as under A, and the year is taken as 50 weeks, then the turnover time is 5 weeks. This 5 weeks is the time for which the variable capital has to be advanced, and the capital advanced for 5 weeks must be 5 times larger than the variable capital applied during 1 week. That is to say, only 1/5 of the capital advanced, here £500, can be applied in the course of a week. In the case of capital B, on the other hand, where the number of turnovers is 1 over 1, the turnover time is 1 year, totaling 50 weeks. The ratio of the capital advanced to that applied week by week is therefore 50 to 1. If the situation was the same for B as for A, then B would have to apply £1,000 each week instead of 100. Secondly, it follows that B has applied a capital 10 times as great as A, i.e. £5,000, in order to set in motion the same amount of variable capital. Thus, with a given rate of surplus value, the same quantity of labor, both paid and unpaid, and thus to produce the same mass of surplus value in the course of the year. The real rate of surplus value expresses nothing more than the ratio of the variable capital applied in a given period of time to the surplus value produced in the same period, or the mass of unpaid labor that the variable capital applied during this time sets in motion. It has absolutely nothing to do with the portion of variable capital that is advanced during the time in which it is not applied, and hence just as little to do with the ratio between the part of it advanced for a definite period of time and that applied during the same period, a ratio which is modified and differentiated by the turnover period. It rather follows from what has already been developed that the annual rate of surplus value coincides with the real rate of surplus value, that which expresses the degree of exploitation of labor only in a single case, namely when the capital advanced turns over only once in the year, so that the capital advanced is equal to the capital turned over during the year, and the ratio of the mass of surplus value produced during the year to the capital applied during the year for the purpose of this production coincides and is identical with the ratio between the mass of surplus value produced during the year and the capital advanced for the year. In the case of A, the annual rate of surplus value is the mass of surplus value produced during the year over the variable capital advanced. But the mass of surplus value produced during the year equals the real rate of surplus value multiplied by the variable capital applied in its production. The capital applied for the production of the annual mass of surplus value is equal to the capital advanced multiplied by the number of its turnovers, which we shall call N. The formula for A is thus transformed into B. The annual rate of surplus value is the real rate of surplus value times the variable capital advanced times N over the variable capital advanced. For example, for capital B, 100% times 5,000 times 1 over 5,000, or 100%. Only in the case that N equals 1, i.e. if the variable capital advanced turns over only once in the year and is thus equal to the capital applied or turned over in the year, is the annual rate of surplus value equal to the real rate of surplus value. Let us call the annual rate of surplus value S prime, the real rate of surplus value small s prime, and the variable capital advanced small v, and the number of turnovers N. Then S prime is equal to small s prime times v times N over v, and also equal to small s prime times N, i.e. S prime is equal to small s prime times N, and is only equal to small s prime if N is equal to 1, when S prime times small s prime times 1 is equal to small s prime. It follows that the annual rate of surplus value is always small s prime times N, i.e. the real rate of surplus value produced in a turnover period by the variable capital consumed during this period multiplied by the number of turnovers of this variable capital during the year, or what is the same thing, multiplied by the reciprocal of its turnover time, reckoned on the basis of a year. If the variable capital turns over 10 times in the year, then its turnover time is 1/10 of a year. The reciprocal of this is therefore 10 over 1, equaling 10. It follows further that S prime is equal to small s prime if N equals 1. S prime is greater than small s prime if N is greater than 1, i.e. if the capital advanced turns over more than once in the year, so that the capital turned over is greater than that advanced. Finally, S prime is smaller than small s prime if N is less than 1, i.e. if the capital turned over during the year is only 1 part of the capital advanced, and the turnover period thus lasts for longer than a year. Let us pause for a moment to consider this last case. We keep all the assumptions made in our earlier example, but simply extend the turnover period to 55 weeks. The labor process demands 100 pounds in variable capital each week, and thus 5,500 pounds for the turnover period, and each week it produces 100 S. Small s prime is thus 100%, as before. The number of turnovers is now 50 over 55, equaling 10 over 11, since the turnover time is 1 plus 1/16 years, the year taken as 50 weeks, totaling 11 over 10 years. S prime is equal to 100% times 5,500 times 10 over 11, over 5,500, which is also equal to 100 times 10 over 11, which is equal to 1,000 over 11, and finally equal to 90 and 10/11%, i.e. less than 100%. In point of fact, if the annual rate of surplus value were 100%, then 5,500V would have to produce 5,500S in a year, whereas it actually now takes 11/10 years for this. The 5,500V produces only 5,000S in the course of the year, giving an annual rate of surplus value of 5,000S over 5,500V, equaling 10 over 11, equaling 90 and 10/11%. The annual rate of surplus value, or the comparison between the surplus value produced during the year and the total variable capital advanced, as distinct from the variable capital turned over during the year, is therefore not something merely subjective, but a comparison produced by the actual movement of capital itself. For the owner of capital A receives back at the end of the year his variable capital of £500 together with a surplus value of £5,000. What expresses the size of the capital he has advanced is not the quantity of capital that he has applied during the year, but that which periodically flows back to him. That the capital may exist at the end of the year partly as a production stock and partly as commodity or money capital adds nothing to the question in hand, nor does the ratio in which it is divided between these various portions. The owner of capital B receives back £5,000, his capital advanced, together with £5,000 surplus value. The owner of capital C, that of £5,500 last introduced, has produced £5,000 surplus value during the year, £5,000 outlay with a rate of surplus value of 100%, but his capital advanced has not yet returned to him, and so neither has the surplus value it has produced. The equation that S prime is equal to small s prime times n expresses the fact that the rate of surplus value on the variable capital applied during a turnover period, this rate being determined by the mass of surplus value produced during a turnover period over the variable capital applied during a turnover period, has to be multiplied by the number of turnover periods or reproduction periods of the variable capital advanced, the number of periods in which it repeats its circuit. We have already seen in Volume 1, Chapter 4, the general formula for capital, and again in Chapter 23, Simple Reproduction, how the capital value is always advanced and not genuinely spent, and that once this value has gone through the various phases of its circuit, it returns again to its starting point, and moreover it does so enriched with surplus value. This is what characterizes it as advanced. The time that elapses between its point of departure and its point of return is the time for which it is advanced. The entire circuit which the capital value undergoes, measured by the time from its advance to its reflux, forms its turnover, and the duration of this turnover is a turnover period. Once this period has elapsed, the circuit is at an end, and the same capital value can begin the same circuit afresh, and thus also valorize itself afresh and again produce surplus value. If the variable capital turns over 10 times in a year, as A does, then the mass of surplus value produced in the course of the year will be 10 times that corresponding to one turnover period. The nature of the advance must now be investigated from the standpoint of capitalist society as a whole. Capital A, which turns over 10 times during the year, is advanced 10 times in the course of the year. It is advanced afresh for each new turnover period. But at the same time, all that the owner of A ever advances during the year is the same capital value of £500, and all that he ever has at his disposal for the production process we are considering is £500. Once this £500 has completed a circuit, he lets the same circuit begin anew. Capital by its very nature only maintains its capital character precisely by functioning as capital in ever-repeated production processes. It is never advanced for longer than 5 weeks. If the turnover lasts for longer, this capital is not sufficient. If it is reduced, then a part of this capital is superfluous. It is not 10 capitals of £500 that are advanced, but one capital of £500 advanced 10 times in succession at different intervals of time. Hence, the annual rate of surplus value is not calculated on a capital of £500 advanced 10 times, i.e. on £5,000, but rather on a capital of £500 advanced once, just as when a shilling circulates 10 times, there is still only 1 shilling in circulation, even though it performs the functions of 10 shillings. However, no matter in whose hands it exists for the moment, it remains as always the same identical value of 1 shilling. Capital A shows in just the same way, each time it returns, including its returns at the end of the year, that its owner has always operated simply with the same capital value of £500. All that he receives back each time is £500. The capital he advances is therefore never more than £500. The capital of £500 that is advanced forms the denominator of the fraction that expresses the annual rate of surplus value. We already had for this formula S prime equals small s prime times V times n over V equals small s prime times n. Since the real rate of surplus value, small s prime equals small s over V, the mass of surplus value divided by the variable capital that produced it, we can substitute in small s prime times n the equivalent of small s prime, i.e. small s over small v, and arrive at the further formula S prime equals small s times n over small v. However, by turning over 10 times, and hence repeating its advance 10 times, the capital of £500 performs the function of a capital 10 times as great, a capital of £5,000, just as 500 shilling pieces that turn over 10 times in the year perform the same function as 5,000 turning over only once. Section 2. The turnover of an individual variable capital. Quote from Volume 1, Chapter 23. Whatever the social form of the production process, it has to be continuous. It must periodically repeat the same phases. When viewed, therefore, as a connected whole, and in constant flux of its incessant renewal, every social process of production is at the same time a process of reproduction. As a periodic increment to the value of the capital, or a periodic fruit borne by capital in process, surplus value acquires the form of a revenue arising out of capital. End quote. We have 10 5-week turnover periods for capital A. In the first turnover period, £500 variable capital is advanced, i.e. £100 is converted each week into labor power so that at the end of the first turnover period, £500 has been spent on labor power. This £500, originally part of the total capital advanced, has ceased to be capital. It has been paid out in wages. The workers, for their part, pay it out again in purchasing their means of subsistence, and consume means of subsistence to the value of £500. A mass of commodities amounting altogether to this value is thereby annihilated. What the worker may save as money, etc., is also not capital. This mass of commodities is consumed unproductively, as far as the worker is concerned, except inasmuch as he thereby maintains his labor power, which is an indispensable instrument for the capitalist in working condition. In the second place, however, this £500 is converted, for the capitalist, into labor power of the same value, or price. He consumes the labor power productively in the same labor process. At the end of the 5 weeks, a value product of £1,000 has been brought into existence. Half of this, £500, is the reproduced value of the variable capital spent as payment for labor power. The other half, £500, is newly produced surplus value. But the 5 weeks labor power, by conversion into which a part of capital has been transformed into variable capital, is also spent or consumed, even if productively. The labor active yesterday is not the same labor as is active today. Its value, together with the surplus value created by it, now exists as the value of a thing distinct from labor power, the product. But because this product is transformed into money, the part of its value equal to the value of the variable capital advanced is converted once more into labor power and hence functions afresh as variable capital. The fact that the capital value that is not only reproduced but also transformed back into the money form may engage the same workers, i.e. the same bearers of labor power, is beside the point. It is quite possible for the capitalist to employ new workers in place of the old ones in the second turnover period. In fact, therefore, in the course of the 10 5-week turnover periods, a capital of £5,000 is successively spent on wages, and not one of £500, these wages being spent again by the workers on means of subsistence. The capital of £5,000 advanced in this way is consumed. It no longer exists. On the other hand, it is labor power to the value of £5,000, and not just £500, that is successively incorporated into the production process, not only reproducing its own value of £5,000, but producing in addition to this a surplus value of £5,000. The variable capital of £500 that is advanced in the second turnover period is not the identical capital of £500 advanced in the first turnover period. The latter has been consumed, spent on wages, but it has been replaced by a new variable capital of £500, which was produced in the first turnover period in the commodity form and was then transformed back into the money form. This new commodity capital of £500 is therefore the money form of the mass of commodities newly produced in the first turnover period. The fact that an identical money sum of £500 exists once more in the hands of the capitalist, i.e. if we disregard the surplus value, the same amount of money capital as he originally advanced, conceals the fact that he is operating with a newly produced capital. As far as the other value components of the commodity capital are concerned, those that replace the constant parts of the capital, their value is not newly produced. It is only the form in which the value exists that is changed. Let us take the third turnover period. Here, it is evident that the variable capital of £500 advanced for the third time is not an old capital, but one newly produced, for it is the money form of the mass of commodities produced in the second turnover period and not in the first turnover period, i.e. the money form of that mass of commodities whose value is equal to the value of the variable capital advanced. The part of their value that equals the variable part of the capital advance was converted into the new labor power for the second turnover period, and produced a new mass of commodities. This was again sold, and a part of their value forms the capital of £500 advanced in the third turnover period. The same thing happens for all 10 turnover periods. Every 5 weeks, newly produced masses of commodities, whose value insofar as it replaces variable capital is also newly produced, and does not simply reappear, as with the constant circulating capital, are thrown onto the market, so that ever new labor power can be incorporated into the production process. What is attained by the tenfold turnover of the variable capital advance, therefore, is not that this capital of £500 can be productively consumed 10 times over, or that a variable capital that suffices for 5 weeks can be applied for 50. In fact, 10 times £500 of variable capital is applied in the 50 weeks. The capital of £500 is only ever sufficient for 5 weeks, and must be replaced at the end of these 5 weeks with a newly produced capital of £500. This occurs just as much for capital A as for capital B. But now comes the difference. At the close of the first section of 5 weeks, a variable capital of £500 has been advanced and spent both in case B and in case A. For B, just as for A, its value has been converted into labor power and replaced by a part of the value of the product newly produced by its labor power equal in value to the advanced variable capital of £500. For both B and A, the labor power has not just replaced the value of the variable capital expended, £500, with a new value of the same amount, but also added to it a surplus value, one of the same size according to our assumption. In case B, however, the value product which replaces the variable capital advanced and adds to its value a surplus value does not exist in the form in which it can function once again as productive capital, i.e. as variable capital. This is the form in which it does exist for A. For B, however, through to the end of the year, while the variable capital spent in the first 5 weeks and then successively every 5 weeks again is replaced by a newly produced value and surplus value, it does not exist in the form in which it can function as productive capital or in particular variable capital. Its value has certainly been replaced by a new value, and thus renewed, but the form of its value, in this case the absolute value form, its money form, has not been renewed. For the second period of 5 weeks, and successively for every 5 weeks during the year, a further £500 must be on hand, just as for the first period. If we ignore credit, then £5,000 must be on hand at the beginning of the year, and exist as latent money capital advanced, even though it is only actually spent and converted into labor power bit by bit in the course of the year. In case A, on the other hand, since the circuit or turnover of the capital advanced has been completed, the replacement value already exists, after 5 weeks have elapsed, in the form in which it can set in motion new labor power for 5 weeks, in its original money form. In both cases, A and B, new labor power is consumed in the second 5-week period, and a new capital of £500 spent in payment for this labor power. The workers' means of subsistence, which were paid for with the first £500, have disappeared, or at any rate the value of these has vanished from the hands of the capitalist. The second £500 serves to buy new labor power, to withdraw new means of subsistence from the market. In short, a new capital of £500 is spent, not the old one. But in case A, this new capital is the money form of the newly produced replacement value for the £500 spent previously. In case B, the replacement value exists in a form in which it cannot function as variable capital. It does exist, but not in the form of variable capital. An additional capital of £500 must therefore be available in the money form, which is here unavoidable, to continue the production process for the next 5 weeks, and it must be advanced as such. Thus, the same amount of variable capital is spent in 50 weeks in case B as in case A, the same amount of labor power paid for and used. But in B, this has to be paid for with the capital advance equal to its entire value, £5,000. In A, however, it is paid for successively by the ever-renewed money form of the replacement value that is produced every 5 weeks for the capital of £500 advanced for each 5 weeks. In this case, therefore, the money capital advanced is never greater than that needed for 5 weeks, i.e. never greater than the capital of £500 advanced for the first 5 weeks. This £500 is sufficient for the whole year. It is clear, therefore, that with the same degree of exploitation of labor, i.e. the same real rate of surplus value, the annual rates in cases A and B must stand in inverse proportion to the magnitude of the variable money capitals that have had to be advanced in order to set in motion the same quantity of labor power over the year. A, 5,000 S over 500 V, totaling 1,000%, and B, 5,000 S over 5,000 V, totaling 100%. But 500V to 5000V is a ratio equal to 1 to 10, which is equal to 100% to 1000%. The distinction arises from the divergence in the turnover periods, i.e. the intervals at which the replacement value of the variable capital applied in a certain period of time can function afresh as capital, and therefore as new capital. With both B and A, we find the same replacement value of the variable capital applied during the same period. There is also the same additional surplus value produced during the same period, but with B, even though every 5 weeks there is a replacement value of £500 plus £500 surplus value, this replacement value does not yet form any new capital, since it does not exist in the money form. In case A, the old capital value is not replaced by a new one but is re-established in its money form, and hence replaced as new capital capable of performing its function. The earlier or later transformation of the replacement value into money, and hence into the form in which the variable capital is advanced, is evidently a circumstance quite immaterial to the production of surplus value. The latter depends on the magnitude of the variable capital applied, and on the level of exploitation of labor. But the circumstances mentioned above does not modify the size of the money capital that has to be advanced in order to set in motion a definite amount of labor power in the course of the year, and in this way, it does affect the annual rate of surplus value. Section 3. The turnover of variable capital considered from the social point of view. Let us consider the matter for a moment from the whole society standpoint. a worker costs, say, £1 per week. The working day is 10 hours. Both with capital A and capital B, 100 workers are employed throughout the year. £100 per week for 100 workers, making £500 for 5 weeks and £5,000 for 50 weeks. And each of these works for 60 hours in a 6-day week. 100 workers perform 6,000 hours of labor per week and therefore 300,000 hours of labor in 50 weeks. This labor power is requisitioned by A and B and cannot be spent by the society on anything else. In this respect, the matter is the same from the social standpoint for both A and B. Moreover, in both cases, each 100 workers receives a yearly wage of £5,000, thus the 200 together receive £10,000, and withdraw from society means of subsistence to this value. In this respect, too, the matter is equivalent in both cases, from the social standpoint. Since the workers are in both cases paid by the week, they also withdraw the means of subsistence from society each week, and each week they cast into circulation and return their money equivalent. But now comes the difference. Firstly, the money that the workers under capital A cast into circulation is not only, as for the workers under capital B, the money form of the value of their labor power, in actual fact a means of payment for labor already performed. Right from the second turnover period onward, reckoning from the opening of the business, it is the money form of their own value product, equaling the price of labor power plus surplus value, in the first turnover period, which pays for their labor during the second turnover period. With capital B, the position is different. Here, too, the money is certainly a means of payment for labor that the workers have already performed, but this labor is not paid for with their own value product turns into money, the money form of the value they themselves have produced. This can only start to happen from the second year onwards, when the workers under capital B are paid with their own value product of the previous year, converted into money. The shorter the turnover period of the capital, and hence the shorter the intervals at which its reproduction period is repeated in the course of the year, the sooner is the variable part of the capital originally advanced by the capitalist in the money form transformed into the money form of the value product created by the worker as a replacement for this variable capital, this product also including surplus value. The shorter, too, is the time for which the capitalist has to advance money from his own funds, and the smaller the total capital that he advances in relation to the given scale of production. The relatively greater, therefore, is the mass of surplus value that the capitalist extracts in the course of the year, at a given rate of surplus value, since he can buy the workers all the more often, and set their labor in motion with the money form of their own value product. At a given scale of production, the absolute size of the variable money capital advanced, and so of the circulating capital in general, is reduced in proportion to the brevity of the turnover period, and the annual rate of surplus value correspondingly grows. With a given volume of capital advanced, the scale of production grows, and hence with a given rate of surplus value, the absolute mass of surplus value produced in one turnover period also grows, and there occurs, simultaneously with this, a rise in the annual rate of surplus value caused by the reduction in the reproduction period. The preceding investigation has led us to the result that, according to the varying magnitudes of the turnover period, money capitals of very different scale have to be advanced in order to set in motion the same volume of productive circulating capital and the same amount of labor, given the same level of exploitation of labor. Secondly, and this is related to the first distinction, in both cases, the workers pay for means of subsistence that they buy with the variable capital that is transformed in their hands into means of circulation. They not only withdraw wheat from the market, for example, but also replace it with an equivalent in money. But since the money with which the workers employed by capital B pay for their means of subsistence and withdraw them from the market is not the money form of their own value product cast into the market in the course of the year, as is the case with the workers employed by capital A, it follows that although they supply the seller of their means of subsistence with money, they do not supply any commodity, either means of production or means of subsistence which he could buy with the money provided, which is the position, however, with A. Hence, labor power, means of subsistence for this labor power, fixed capital in the form of the means of labor applied under capital B, and production materials are all withdrawn from the market, and an equivalent in money is cast into the market to replace them with. But no product is cast into the market during the year in question to replace the material elements of productive capital withdrawn from it. If we were to consider a communist society in place of a capitalist one, then money capital would immediately be done away with, and so too the disguises that transactions acquire through it. The matter would be simply reduced to the fact that the society must reckon in advance how much labor, means of production, and means of subsistence it can spend, without dislocation, on branches of industry which, like the building of railways for instance, supply neither means of production nor means of subsistence, nor any kind of useful effect for a long period, a year or more, though they certainly do withdraw labor, means of production, and means of subsistence from the total annual product. In capitalist society, on the other hand, where any kind of social rationality asserts itself only post festum, major disturbances can and must occur constantly. On the one hand, there is pressure on the money market, while conversely, the absence of this pressure itself calls into being a mass of such undertakings, and therefore the precise circumstances that later provoke a pressure on the money market. The money market is under pressure because large-scale advances of money capital for long periods of time are always needed here. This is quite apart from the fact that industrialists and merchants throw the money capital they need for the carrying on of their businesses into railway speculations, etc., and replace it with loans from the money market. The other side of the coin is pressure on society's available productive capital. Since elements of productive capital are constantly being withdrawn from the market, and all that is put into the market is an equivalent in money, the effective demand rises, without this in itself providing any element of supply. Hence, prices rise, both for the means of subsistence and for the material elements of production. During this time, too, there are regular business swindles, and a great transfer of capital. A band of speculators, contractors, engineers, lawyers, etc. enrich themselves. These exert a strong consumer demand on the market, and wages rise as well. As far as foodstuffs are concerned, agriculture is given a boost by this process. But since these foodstuffs cannot be suddenly increased within the year, imports grow, as well as the import of exotic foods, coffee, sugar, wine, etc., and objects of luxury. Hence, oversupply and speculation in this part of the import trade. On the other hand, in those branches of industry in which production can be increased more quickly, manufacture proper, mining, etc., the price rise leads to sudden expansion, soon followed by collapse. The same effect occurs on the labor market, drawing great numbers of the latent relative surplus population and even workers already employed into the new lines of business. Undertakings of this kind, such as railways, generally withdraw from the labor market on a large scale a quantity of force, which can derive only from branches such as agriculture, etc., where only strong lads are needed. This still occurs even after the new undertakings have already become an established branch of industry and the migrant working class needed for them has already been formed. For example, when railway construction is temporarily pursued on a scale greater than the average. A part of the reserve army of workers, whose pressure keeps wages down, is absorbed. Wages generally rise, even in the formerly well-employed sections of the labor market. This lasts until, with the inevitable crash, the reserve army of workers is again released and wages are pressed down once more to their minimum and below it. Inasmuch as the greater or lesser length of the turnover period depends on the working period in the strict sense, i.e., the period needed to prepare the product for the market, it depends on the material conditions of production in the various spheres of capital investment, as these are given at the time. In agriculture, these have more the character of natural conditions of production. In manufacture, and for the most part in extractive industries too, they change with the social development of the productive process itself. Inasmuch as the length of the working period depends on the size of deliveries, on the quantitative scale on which the product is generally thrown into the market, this has a conventional character. But the convention itself has as its material basis the scale of production, and is therefore accidental only if considered in isolation. Finally, inasmuch as the length of the turnover period is dependent on the length of the circulation period, this is partly conditioned by the constant change in market conditions, the greater or lesser ease of selling, and the necessity, which arises from this, of casting the product partly on nearer and partly on more distant markets. Apart from the scale of demand in general, the movement of prices plays a major role here. Sales are deliberately restricted when prices are falling, while production goes ahead, and the converse occurs when prices are rising, when production and sale keep in step, or selling even takes place in advance. However, the actual distance of the place of production from the market outlet should be considered as a specific material basis. English cotton cloth or yarn, for instance, is sold to India. The export merchant has to pay the English cotton manufacturer. He does this willingly only when the situation on the money market is favorable. As soon as the manufacturer himself replaces his money capital by credit operations, things start to go wrong. The exporter later sells his cotton goods on the Indian market, from where the capital he advanced is remitted. Until this reflux, the situation is just the same as one in which the length of the working period requires a new advance of money capital in order to keep the production process going on the same scale. The money capital with which the manufacturer pays his workers and replaces the other elements of his circulating capital is not the money form of the yarn that he produced. This can only be the case after the value of this yarn has returned to England in money or products. It is additional money capital, as before. The distinction is simply that instead of the manufacturer, it is the merchant who advances it, and he may well have obtained it himself by credit operations. Similarly, until this money has been cast into the market, no additional product has been put on the English market that could be bought with this money and enter the sphere of production or individual consumption. If this condition sets in for a long while and on a large scale, then it must lead to the same results as the prolonged working period did previously. It is also possible that the yarn is sold on credit in India itself. With this credit, products are bought in India and sent as return shipment to England, or else drafts are remitted to this amount. If this process is delayed, then pressure builds up on the Indian money market, which may react on England to produce a crisis here. This crisis, in its turn, even if it is combined with the export of precious metals to India, provokes a new crisis in that country on account of the bankruptcy of the English firms and their Indian branches, who were given credit by Indian banks. Thus, a simultaneous crisis arises both on the market for which the trade balance is unfavorable and on that for which it is favorable. This phenomenon can be still more complicated. England may have sent silver bullion to India, but India's English creditors now press their demands here, and in a short while India will have to send its silver back to England. It can happen that export trade to India and the import trade from India are in approximate balance, even though the size of the latter, with the exception of special circumstances such as an increase in cotton prices, etc., is determined by the former and stimulated by it. The balance of trade between England and India may appear in equilibrium, or exhibit only weak fluctuations on one side or the other. But once the crisis breaks out in England, it becomes clear that unsold cotton goods are being stored up in India, goods which have therefore not been transformed from commodity capital into money capital, overproduction on this side, and that on the other hand, there are not only unsold stocks of Indian products in England, but a major part of stocks sold and consumed have not yet been paid for. Thus, what appears as a crisis on the money market, in actual fact, expresses anomalies in the production and reproduction process itself. Thirdly, in relation to the actual circulating capital applied, both variable and constant, the length of the turnover period, insofar as it derives from the length of the working period, leads to the distinction that, with a greater number of turnovers in the course of the year, an element of the variable or constant circulating capital can be supplied by way of its own product, as with the production of coal, of ready-made clothes, etc. In other situations, this is not the case, at least not within the year.